To conclude Chapter 11, East Asia, some of the economic and geopolitical features of this region of the world. China is poster child par excellence of the industrial export economy of the neoliberalist theory of globalization. China has also had population control policies historically, and we'll also talk a little bit about the agricultural features of East Asia. A little bit of history. Historically, China reached its height as an empire in the 1700s, and then after that, because of the Opium Wars imposed on them by the British, there was a steady decline in the Qin dynasty, or the Manchu dynasty as it's called by some historians. It resulted finally in the collapse of that dynasty in 1911, and then there was the Civil War after World War II, and the communists triumphed. More on that in a moment. Under Chairman Mao, they attempted the Great Leap Forward, which was a disastrous economic policy, because in order to meet their industrial quotas of the commune, they had to make so much steel. They had little steel mills right in little local areas, and the peasants, in order to meet their quota, melted their tools, and this resulted in famine, and millions starved in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and Mao fell out of favor as a result of this, and he comes back with a vengeance in the Cultural Revolution of 1966, which goes on until his death in 1976. And since the late 70s, China has moved more towards a modified capitalist system. The state continues to run a lot of heavy industry. There's still a monopoly of the Communist Party politically, but there are more and more capitalist features in that region. It started in agriculture in the late 1970s. The communal farms were abandoned and individuals were allowed to act as entrepreneurs, and that allowed them to increase their income. They could have their own little businesses on the side along with growing their food, and they were allowed to keep that money, and that really improved the financial conditions of many people. In the late 1980s, focus shifted toward the urban industrial sector, and farmers began to suffer again because of price caps and increased taxation. And many were forced to leave their farm because they could not meet their bills and responsibilities, or instead of migrating into the cities, they out-migrated overseas. Industrial reform featured special economic zones, direct foreign investment, neoliberalism, and there was little state interference. Shenzhen, near Hong Kong, manufacturers took advantage of cheap land and labor, and soon other zones opened in the coastal region. And this has been very successful, attracting foreign investment to generate exports. All these little manufacturing concerns then sell their goods overseas, and the income could supply China with capital for infrastructure improvements, which then creates more wealth, which then in the long term means that they're not relying so much on exports, but they're relying on what they can do within the country. And there are many economists around the world who fully embrace this idea as a way of long-term growth and stability for a country's economy. And it's estimated they accounted earlier in the 21st century for over a third of the total world growth in the output of gross national product, which doesn't subtract what you're doing within. Total growth, some kind of GNP figure. They accounted for most of what went on. They've kept inflation under control. They still have some central planning, and there's tension with the U.S. because they artificially hold down the value of their currency. The renminbi is used domestically, while the yuan is the currency that they use with the rest of the world. It's artificially low. Why? So their exports and their products are cheaper. There has been some social and regional differentiation. Basically, we talked about China proper and the coast. Most of that benefit has gone to Beijing and the coastal regions. And market reforms have accelerated the process of regional economic differentiation. We talked about some of that. The vast interior still is pretty poverty-stricken. They're still officially socialist, but in order to create real wealth, you have to allow individuals to possess that wealth because, ladies and gentlemen, they're not going to put it underneath their mattress. They're going to invest it in some other enterprise, which then employs people who then make wages that they go and they spend in order for another person to make a wage, which they go and spend. And so it goes as the pump gets primed and people spend. And they've been buying a lot of luxury automobiles, which has helped the German economy because the Chinese like Mercedes-Benz. And all of these different areas have grown. But some things like the guaranteed housing, guaranteed medical care, and other social services has been in decline as many of those state-owned enterprises shut down because they can't compete. And that's hurt many elderly people. Many of them are destitute. And many various amounts of capital have flowed to the south from the influence of Hong Kong, which is a huge financial sector. And many of these different areas, regions of the world have invested in the Hong Kong region. And the Yangtze Delta, or Shanghai, has been revived since the decline of the power of the Communist Party. And that industrial park is a big city today. Singapore has invested in this particular park. This is another industrial development. And here is another big regional area that's attempting to be revived, because the farther north you go, the Rust Belt is in that region. That's where all the old heavy industries were. And the oil wells have dried up. And Russia has talked about building a pipeline to Manchuria in hopes of reviving those heavy industries. Many rural areas suffer from underemployment and outmigration, as we mentioned. And the further you get from the coast inland, the more poverty there is. China is attempting to encourage development with new factories in these particular regions out west. And vast sums are being spent on transportation infrastructure and telecommunications. All in all, the Chinese are substantially better off financially. Less than 10% overall live below the poverty line. And since 2005, 70% of the economy is controlled by the private sector. Chairman Mao, where have you gone? It's still the most populous country on earth. We talked about that in South Asia. That's going to change any year now because of the one-child policy. It's worked. The population growth is very, very slow now. But as we talked about, baby boys outnumber baby girls. International women's groups are very, very angry about some of these policies. But environmentalists applaud China for lowering the birth rate. Now, some of the agricultural practices. Japan is very, very efficient in making use of what limited farmland is available. They attempt to remain self-sufficient in food. They do grow a lot of rice because the rice growers are very politically powerful, and they're protected in the tax code because it's considered to be an essential cultural and spiritual aspect of Japan. The Zaibatsu, or the great family firms like Mitsubishi, Honda, Suzuki, and so on, they came back during the Cold War because of the United States wanting to make Japan a strong economy, and it worked. But these are family firms, and they're not really export-oriented to the point where they're going to compete with an open economy. It's not. And because these are bureaucratic firms, and critics claim that this is a reason for the stagnation since the late 1990s. We talked about the Yangtze River. These are some of the areas that grow these particular crops. The farther south you go, more rice is grown because there's a longer growing season as it's warmer. Here is another geographic term, the anthropogenic landscape, one that has been heavily transformed by human activity, mainly deforestation, which ruined the topsoil, which then, if it gets flooded or if there's a lot of wind, it blows away. They attempt to grow those more northern crops in those areas. Manchuria has at least 100 million people. They tend to be successful in growing food. And there's about 70 million people in the Loess Plateau, with people migrate in and out of this region. We mentioned a 300 million figure earlier. That's counting the entire region. And they've attempted to live with some kind of subterranean housing there periodically because of the vast height of some of that particular material, the loess. But it's subject to earthquakes. North Korea has about 23 million. This is a couple-year-old statistic. 48 million in the south. And the entire peninsula occupies an area less than the state of Minnesota in the United States, dominated by rice. In the north, more corn, because it doesn't need as much irrigation. Taiwan is the most densely populated state in Asia. It has 22 million people in an area the size of the Netherlands. And they have to import food. And overall, these three regions of East Asia must import food to meet the overall demand of the population. The geopolitical topics: the Opium War destabilized the Qin dynasty or the Manchu dynasty to the point where all of the imperial powers of the West, Germany, Italy, France, England, the United States, had spheres of influence, culminating in the revolution where the dynasty collapsed, and then the warlords and the Kuomintang fought it out with the Communist Party, and that will be solved by the communists winning. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to divide Korea at the 38th parallel. The U.S. troops occupied the South, and slowly the Russians and the Chinese, who were still friendly at that time, there was a big schism between the Soviets and the Chinese in the 1950s, and the Chinese came to be more of the chief supporter of North Korea. Misinterpreting the containment policy outlined by Secretary of State Dean Acheson in the very, very early Truman administration, in the early 50s I'm talking about, Kim Il-sung, who was the father of Kim Jong-un, who his son is now the dictator or controlling authority figure in North Korea, Kim Jong-un. He's been in power since 2012. He died in 2012. Here's the original. They invaded the South, hoping to unify it as a communist country. That resulted in the Korean conflict or Korean War, 1950 to 53. The United Nations, predominantly United States troops, along with some Turkish, Hungarian soldiers, some British soldiers as well, mostly Americans. The Soviets were boycotting the Security Council at the time, so they didn't veto the Security Council's okay of the UN sending troops. Why were they boycotting? Because mainland China was not considered to be the seat on the Security Council. It was Formosa, or Taiwan, which is where the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, escaped to after losing the Civil War. The U.S. supported the South, and because of mistakes made during the conduct of the conflict, General MacArthur said that they would never jump in, and the Chinese jumped in full force. And eventually, the country continues to be divided at the 38th parallel. There is periodic protest against U.S. troop presence. There was some attempt to improve relations in the 90s, but Kim Jong-un's nuclear saber rattling has created a lot of tension with the United States in the last 3 or 4 years. This is one of the last totalitarian states in the world. And finally, what will be the future with Taiwan? Beijing still says it's part of China. The nationalists still believe that they're the legitimate government. Technically, they're still at war. In the 1950s and 60s, U.S. recognized Taiwan as being the legitimate government. There was no relations with mainland China until the ping pong diplomacy of 1971. Yes, Forrest Gump did go. Oh, excuse me, he did not, but there was a ping pong team sent with secret diplomats, which resulted in the ace, the historic Cold Warrior Richard Milhous Nixon actually made a visit on Air Force One to the mainland in 1972, and one of his greatest triumphs of his presidency, he reestablished relations with mainland China. They do not want to see Taiwan become an independent country. They were forced to use the name Chinese Taipei when they joined the World Trade Organization. 74% of the island considers themselves to be a sovereign country, and the question, will China eventually reclaim Taiwan as part of the People's Republic? Taiwan is one of the wealthiest areas of the planet, just between the mainland and the island, right? There's 22 million people in Taiwan. Just between the mainland and the island, there's over $100 billion in trade for 22 million people. That doesn't even count what they do with the rest of the world. Wow, they're really having some serious financial wealth. And that ends chapter 11.